Got it going.
All right, today is March 1st, 2018. I am Jason Kraft interviewing Dr. Jamie Martin about her experiences related to the three-day strike between October 19th and 21st of 2016 among the 14 schools that make up the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education known as PASHE, in response to stalled contract negotiations between the state system and the Association of Pennsylvania State College University Faculties, or APSCUF. So starting off, would you please state your full name and for accuracy spell it?
Sure. My name is Jamie Martin. J-A-M is in mom, I-E, M-A-R-T-I-N.
Okay, and just to start off, I guess I just wanted to get a few background questions to set it up a little bit. So are you originally from Pennsylvania?
I am from Pennsylvania, a small town near Pittsburgh called Freeport, Pennsylvania.
What kind of careers did your parents have when were they unionized, or did you have any experience like in the when you were younger?
Sure. My dad was actually a steel worker, so he was a member of the United Steelworkers. My oldest sister also worked in the same plant where he had worked, so she was also a member as well as my brother-in-law. So I had some experience growing up understanding what unions did, especially in the industrial component or industrial areas where it's dangerous work. And so they did a lot for improving working conditions and those kinds of things. So I did have that experience.
Now, were they in any like leadership positions, or were they just members of the union?
My dad was a member of the union. My brother-in-law and sister were actually involved in some role in the leadership of that particular steelworkers union.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to set up a little bit of background.
Sure.
So going a little further beyond that, could you tell me a little bit about your academic background?
Sure. I started actually as here at IUP when I started my undergraduate work, and after I completed that in criminology with a minor in psychology, I went to work as a juvenile probation officer at the county level, and my primary caseload there were adolescent sex offenders. And that was kind of a tough group to work with. And at that point, being back in the classroom looked good. So I came back to work on my master's degree. And at the same time, I was working in a community mental health center, doing intakes for individuals who either had a psychiatric hospitalization or were just wanting to tap into some of our services. When I completed my master's degree, I went back to that agency, and I worked as the supervisor of the intensive case management unit. And in that capacity, we were working with young people that were at risk of psychiatric hospitalizations. And that was another difficult and pretty stressful job. So at that point, I decided classroom looked pretty good again. So I came back for my PhD, and that's kind of how I ended up here.
So going off that, so at what capacity do you work here now? Like, I suppose, what do you do?
Okay, so I'm a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Most of my research interests are in, and I can empathize with what you're doing. I do a lot of research in jails and prisons, and so I've done a lot of interviews with primarily incarcerated fathers, some incarcerated moms wanting to know what it's like to be separated from their children and how that impacts them and their kids. I teach classes both at all three levels, the undergraduate, master's, and doctoral level. And at the doctoral level, I do teach a qualitative methods course. So, as I said, I can empathize with what you're doing in terms of interviews and transcriptions.
Yeah. So, in addition, are you engaged in any other campus roles other than teaching?
Not currently. Prior to becoming the vice president of the union at the state level, I did. I wasn't. Are you talking about union activities or just?
Oh, just any really.
Okay. So I've had a lot of other service activities, both in the union and just more generally. So I've served on university-wide undergraduate curriculum committee, the graduate curriculum committee. I've served on a number of union committees. So I was the grievance chair for a while. I served on meet and discuss. Mm-hmm. And then again, when I took over as the vice president of APSCUF, it's really limited the amount of time I have to devote to other kinds of campus activities.
Okay, so I guess we could get a little bit into your role in the union. So could you tell me about I guess before you became the vice president, about your involvement in the union.
Excuse me. And as I mentioned, at the local level, I did work as the grievance chair, which was pretty stressful. And I did serve on the local meet and discuss team, and that's an opportunity for individuals, faculty members from APSCUF to sit down across the table with individuals from the administration and try to work out any problems that we might have. Then I got involved at the state level, and I was elected as a member of the statewide executive council. And so in that role, I was not one of the officers yet, but there are the 4 officers and then 3 at-large members. Mm-hmm. When I was on the executive council, I also served on the personnel committee. So in that committee, we would deal with any kind of issues related to the personnel that work at the state office or any of the office managers at all 14 campuses. And after serving on that for, I think, 3 years, maybe it was 2 years, but then I was asked to run for vice president. And so I did, and I'm now in my 4th year, and then we have an election coming up in April, and I've agreed to run again. So if I do that, that'll be 6 years as the vice president.
After reading through that, I don't envy you.
You don't envy me? Yeah.
It seems really stressful. So looking at the union, so what activities is APSCUF involved in on campus? Are they involved in any activities on campus at all?
Here on the local level?
Yes.
They're involved in, we try to do a lot for the students, so there are scholarships that are available. I'm sure at the end of the semester you'll see probably APSCUF members out serving cookies around finals week. We always do a move-in day. Mm-hmm. So when the freshmen are moving in, we will be out and about different locations and handing out bottles of water to the kids and parents. And I think last year we gave them thumb drives. So yeah, we try to get involved, and even sponsoring, I think, Little League teams or those. I don't know if it's a Little League team, but we have some involvement there. And certainly at the state level, we're involved with a lot of other unions to try to deal with issues that we have common interests with just other kinds of labor unions. So yeah, I think APSCUF here is a pretty active chapter because I now travel to the other 13 universities, so I have a pretty good handle on how active our leadership is here.
So I guess bringing it a little bit back to you. So how did you get involved? How did you get involved in the union?
So my husband and I have 2 sons, and once they were both out of high school, that's when I got more active. I've always been a member of APSCUF, but I really focused more on raising our kids. Once they were grown, I wanted to take a more active role, and so I spoke with the individual who's running for chapter president at that time, who's Susan Drummond. And being a chapter president's a lot of work, and so I said to her, I'll do anything I can to support you and to help. And so I just started to get involved that way, and it was at that point she asked me to be on the meet and discuss team, and then also asked if I'd take over as grievance chair. And I was like, really? That's what you want me to do? So I kind of waded into it just by getting a little bit more active locally. And I also, and I guess I forgot to mention this, I ran and was elected as a delegate to our legislative assembly. And so that is the policy-making and decision-making body of APSCUF. And so there are, I think, about 13 delegates from IUP, and there are delegates from all 14. So I served in that role too. So I kind of got involved once our kids were grown and felt like I could take the time and spend it focusing on helping other people.
Okay. So we already kind of talked about how you became the vice president of the state union, but you were also the negotiations team chair for the negotiations that led up to the strike. So how did you get involved in that role?
Okay. The way the bylaws are written now, there are people that are nominated to be on the negotiations team. And we have a negotiations team, and those were the we were the ones sitting at the table negotiating. And then we have a negotiation committee, and the committee is made up of all 14 chapter presidents. So it's the chapter presidents who look over the people that are nominated and then take their recommendations to the Legislative Assembly, and then it's voted on by the Legislative Assembly who should make up the team. So that's how I got involved with that. And then once I was on the team, then there's a vote among the team members as to who should be the chair of the negotiations team. So that was my role. And then I also served on the negotiations committee for the coaches. So they were negotiating a contract at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I was on both of those negotiations teams.
I wasn't aware of that. Were the negotiations between any different between like the coaches negotiating and the teacher the other faculty negotiating?
There were some differences. The coaches' contract is very different, and part of what happens when you're trying to make a decision about what are the important issues. So we do surveys of the faculty to see what are the kinds of issues that they're concerned about. And we also did some conference calls with specific groups of faculty. So for example, counseling faculty, library faculty, so faculty members whose primary responsibilities might be outside the classroom. We also do something similar with the coaches to find out what are their issues. The other part of it is typically once the faculty settle their contract and we have an idea of what kinds of health benefits we're able to negotiate, typically the coaches get the same benefits. So at the coaches negotiations, you're not negotiating on some of those big issues. Mm-hmm. They just wait until we're finished. But and they had a slightly larger team, but their negotiations, a lot of what they're waiting to see how ours go, and then after we settled ours, they were able to settle theirs without any kind of labor strife.
Okay. Yeah, we jumped ahead a little bit, but that's okay. Fine. So, what does your role normally entail whenever you're not whenever you're not on strike or you're not
negotiating?
Yeah.
So I go to Harrisburg probably at least twice a month. I go for a 2-day period where we have our executive council meetings and personnel committee meetings. So I do that. There are times I was out there last week and went to the Capitol to sit in on the appropriations hearings. So the state system will go before the House and the Senate and make their argument for why they need money from the legislature to be able to run. So I sometimes go to the Capitol and I sit in on those budget appropriations hearings. There are times I go to the Capitol to actually meet with legislators to try to make sure that they know what our issues are and to seek funding. Mm-hmm. So I have that part. Typically my second trip, and I forgot to mention this, I'm on the statewide meet and discuss team. And so in that capacity I go and we sit down, and there are going to be faculty. We represent all 14 universities and sit across the table from individuals from the state system. And again, try to work out those types of issues. There are times I visit other campuses. So last summer, whenever there were retrenchment notices, and those are when a university is notifying faculty that they may lay off. Mm-hmm. Faculty, they have a duty, an obligation to actually meet and discuss about that. So I traveled to Edinburgh a couple times to sit in on their local meet and discuss meetings to make sure that they're fulfilling their obligation. Mm-hmm. I think I did the same thing at Clarion. So there are times in the western part of the state I'll be traveling to local universities or other universities to help them with issues related to retrenchment. So I'm able to stay pretty busy.
It seems like it. So just looking at it all in general, so what kind of skills do you think a person needs to have to do your job in the union?
I think you have to be dedicated. You have to have a firm belief in why we have a collective bargaining agreement, and sometimes we have to remind the administration here and at the state level that it's our collective bargaining agreement. It's not the faculty. I mean, both sides sign it. So you have to be, really committed to that. You have to be willing to give up quite a bit of time. I think you have to have good communication skills, good listening skills, but you have to be willing to stand firm. So I think it's important to try to find middle ground and to work toward a common goal. But there are times when you still have to stay firm and say, we're not going to agree on this. We have to have a little bit of less agreement, and it might not be quite conciliatory. So I think all of those kinds of things, but the dedication and commitment to the whole notion of what a union does.
Okay, and kind of related to that, what kinds of skills do you think you developed while fulfilling these roles? I
think first, just not necessarily skills, but a much better understanding of the differences and similarities between the 14 universities. I think I've developed probably some of my communication skills. I've got to learn some new things about how politics, how that works, and so I've gotten the opportunity and have developed my knowledge base. So this has really taken me out of my comfort zone in teaching, and it's given me a whole new way of a new opportunity to get involved in other kinds of things. So that has been really refreshing and has been good for me in terms of just doing something completely different.
You talk about how it gave you a chance to do things you hadn't done before. So had you had any experience negotiating before you had been elected the chair of the committee?
No, that was my first time through, and the part that was most difficult for me to understand from people who had negotiated prior is that you're expecting things to be logical, and they're not. So as faculty, we think, you have this problem. We can sit down and do research, and we can lay out, here's why, this makes the most sense, and this is why our position makes the most sense, and it doesn't matter. And it was the most bizarre thing to just think, okay, this is a logical conclusion, and you're saying, that doesn't make sense. The other thing I wasn't aware of is how much dead time there was. So we would be sitting at the table, and we would pass across the table proposals, and then a lot of times either the state system would want to caucus and they would leave, or we would want to caucus, and so there were times that you might not be sitting across from them for 2 or 3 hours. So I just wasn't aware of exactly what that looked like, and there was a long period of time that we weren't negotiating at all because the state system had hired a different law firm, and so for about a 4-month period we didn't meet at all. So I wasn't aware of how time-consuming and how difficult the process could be.
So why weren't you guys able to meet? Was it something on their part that they didn't want to meet?
Right. They had hired a new law firm, so the attorney that had been their spokesperson was no longer there, so they had to get another person who then had to get familiar with the issues. So there was a 4-month period of time when we didn't meet. And then when we were getting ready to start again, they gave us about a 246-page comprehensive proposal that we had to go through page by page to figure out what they were suggesting the changes were, and some looked pretty minor, but you still had to go through all of that proposal, so that took a lot of time as well. And so there were a lot of roadblocks. I still believe firmly that they pushed us to the point of a strike.
Okay, so I guess we could go into looking at the pre-strike negotiations a little bit. So could you tell me how negotiations normally take place between the union and the state?
Yeah, again, we would set up meetings. For faculty, it's easier to negotiate in the summer, because even if you're teaching, you know exactly what it's going to be a more limited time. But we would go through a full summer and have almost no meetings, and so now we'd get into the fall or spring, and we have to work around our schedules, our teaching schedules. It's not as if you can say, sure, we can just come in on a Wednesday. So then it gets a little trickier to find days to actually meet. And then, as I mentioned, we would go usually to either to the state system office, or we would meet in the APSCUF office and identify proposals, parts of the contract that either side wants to try to deal with. And so, you could go for several weeks and not meet, or sometimes we would go and we might have a 3-day session. But basically, you're not making changes to every article in the contract. You're identifying, like, what are the important parts, what are the important things to us, and they're deciding what are the important things to them. And then you try to find some middle ground on those things. So for us, the big issue is retrenchment. And obviously, looking at health benefits, but also protections for some of, especially our adjunct faculty. Those were critical issues that we dealt with. And so it's a situation where we're sitting across the table and they have their important things, we have our important things, and you try to hammer those out. But as I mentioned, there were a lot of laws in that. And you asked about the pre-strike, getting closer to the strike.
Right now, I guess we're just looking at just in general.
Yeah.
I have a few questions later, like when it was getting closer.
Okay, so that's what it was like, and we were negotiating for about 1.5 years. It's hard for me to remember. I think I've tried to kind of repress some of it, but we went for a full year plus without a contract. So we were working under the conditions of the prior one.
I actually had that question. I know one issue that it talks about in the strike journal early on was APSCUF's reluctance to have proposals posted online. So that's why they kind of stalled out a little bit. Now, could you tell me a little bit about that?
I don't think that stalled negotiations, but what happened there was
difficult. Yeah.
It made it difficult. When you're negotiating, you are going to typically see, you're starting, and you're not going to be able to get what I'm doing with my hands here on tape, but you're going to have one side start at one extreme and the other side at the other extreme. So if you're thinking just about, I'm trying to think of an issue, I could give you an example. Let's say it's just you're negotiating about compensation. They're going to say, we don't want to give you any increase. We want you to take 0%. And we're going to start at a number that we know we're not going to get. So we're going to say we want 5%. And then you try to work to the middle. But if we would have put a proposal on the table that said, in year 1 we wanted 5%, in year 2 we wanted 5%, in year 3 we wanted 5%, and they put that on their webpage, and then their spokesperson went out and said, look how greedy the faculty are, they're asking for 15% over 3 years. That was the reluctance. And so if we would have given them written proposals that we knew they were going to post, and we know that the proposals that you're first putting on are going to be things that they're never going to agree to, that was the concern. And so and they had never done that before, and they kept saying we've posted these before, and they hadn't. And so that really, it broke down our ability to have those kinds of frank discussions without them being posted. And then without their spokesperson going into the media and talking about how greedy the faculty are. So it made it tough.
Now, did that get solved eventually?
It seemed like it, and again, some of these details are a bit foggy, but at some point they must have agreed not to, because we then handed across the table a significant number of proposals. And we had to get their agreement that they weren't going to post them, and for the reasons I just laid out. And they hadn't done it in previous negotiations, even though they claimed to. We were able to demonstrate that they had not. And they also weren't honest about, they put out a lot of information about how much the contract was going to cost. And it wasn't accurate. And we were able to demonstrate during negotiations that it wasn't accurate. And then they just kind of stopped talking about how much it was going to cost, because they put out this number that was just wasn't accurate. It was way overstated the amount that the contract was going to cost.
So did that seem like, I guess not an honest mistake, but did it seem malicious that they were putting this information out there?
It seemed I don't want to say malicious. I mean, obviously both sides are going to try to put out information that would get public support. It was, I want to be careful in the words I choose. It was a careless mistake. At some level, it resulted from incompetence. And what happened was they had added an extra year. So we were negotiating for, say it's a 3-year contract, they added an extra year that we wouldn't have been negotiating for and added all those costs in. So they put an extra year in their calculations. And when we pointed that out, they were kind of like, well, we always do it that way. And we're like, no, you don't always do it that way. So they had to back off on what they were calculating the cost to be because they added an extra year onto their calculations.
It's weird.
Yeah.
Okay, so a few times in the journal, it's mentioned that other unions in the state system were able to secure better contracts than were offered to APSCUF. And I was wondering if you could go into who those unions were and what kind of contracts that they received.
The one that I recall the most would have been AFSCME.
Could you spell that?
Yeah, AFSCME, I believe. I had to remember what it's American Federation of, I should know it, but AFSCME is also represented on this campus, so a lot of, like in our department, our secretaries are members of AFSCME. And a lot of, and those contracts are negotiated between the union and then primarily the governor. And a lot of times the other unions have to wait to see what AFSCME is going to get because they are such a large union, and then that will, at some level, limit the amount of compensation other unions are going to get. But I have to be honest, I don't recall all of the specifics of their particular contract, but in terms of health benefits, I think they were able to secure better ones than we eventually were.
Do you know, would you have like a reason of why that is? Maybe just they're bigger, or?
You mean why everybody kind of waits to see?
Oh, like why they were able to secure.
Again, probably because, I mean, they are a large union, but they're negotiating directly with the governor.
Oh.
And we negotiate with the Board of Governors and negotiate with the state system, and so that makes it a little bit trickier. And obviously, we're not as large as AFSCME, but I forget how long their negotiations lasted, but it wasn't nearly as long as ours.
Okay. So in the journal, it mentions that the union considered going on strike in spring of 2016. So could you tell me what gave rise to the desire to strike at that point and why you eventually didn't?
Yeah, and actually I was involved in trying to dissuade us from going on strike at that point. We were at a legislative assembly, and there were individuals who wanted to go on strike at that time, and my biggest concern was the negative impact it was going to have on our students. And I think it's important to mention that was always a consideration. My concern was if we did it at that point, and we now had students that were getting close to graduation, didn't have any idea how that might impact the graduation of the senior class. And so I actually spoke at the assembly and tried to encourage us to wait and to try over the summer to get this worked out, knowing that if we didn't strike in April, it didn't mean we couldn't strike later. But I was really concerned at that point about the impact for the graduating seniors.
So was there a decent push from the other side wanting to strike? How big would you say was I guess the portion of people who wanted to strike in that time?
I mean, there were certainly people that I think they were just saying enough is enough. we've been doing this for how long? We don't seem to be making much progress, and that was true at that point. So there were people, and there still were. We did take a vote, and there still were people who wanted to strike at that time. But I think, with me talking and trying to urge against it, and some others, there were people that said, we have the chair of the negotiations team who's saying we shouldn't do it now. Let's see if we can work this out. And so I think, not just because it was me, but because if you have the negotiations team saying let's try this a little bit longer, I think that carried some weight. Mm-hmm. So the people were willing to wait, but we were also then able to go back to the table and say, look, we're getting pressure from our members that they're getting fed up. So that didn't seem to carry much weight with them, though.
So obviously, some things did change between then and October when you did strike. So what changed between then and the time when you did strike in October that made you guys finally decide to go on strike?
We had really just, things had stalled. We had gotten to an impasse on a number of really important issues. One that was remaining had to do with our adjunct faculty. They wanted, right now, faculty on our campus and the other 13 teach a 4-4 load, so teach 4 classes both semesters. And quite honestly, that's a heavy load if you look across the United States and even at some of our comparison schools. I have students who leave our program and go to other schools and are teaching maybe a 2-2 or 2-3. But what they wanted to do to our adjunct was to give them a 5-5 load, which would mean that they'd be teaching another class for no additional compensation, which would have been basically a huge load. But our fear was they would never ever give them 5 classes. Mm-hmm. They'd give them 4 classes, which would have been a 20% pay cut. So that was a large issue. And at one point during negotiations, one of the individuals from the state system on their negotiations team said, and they later denied this, but said that at a university that he worked with, the adjunct taught more classes, and they called them teaching machines. And so the discussion went for a bit, and it was about over, and I went back to it and said, I just want to clarify, Roger, you said that you called them teaching machines. And then he was backtracking and said, well, we probably shouldn't have called them that. But that became during the strike and some of the rallies leading up that, we're not going to be teaching machines. So there were those kinds of issues. There are still issues with retrenchment in the article that we were concerned about. And then still issues with the health benefits, because they wanted to make really radical and dramatic changes to those. So as we move through the summer and now moving closer to the fall, we just weren't making progress on those kinds of issues. Mm. I want to wait till when I get closer to the actual strike, because we had a long negotiation session leading up to that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the teaching machines, I actually had that in here. Whenever I was reading through the journal, it seemed, at least from the side of the state during the negotiations through the press release, it seemed like there was a lot of, at least from one side, animosity inside during the negotiations. I just wanted, if you wanted to confirm or deny that.
A lot of animosity?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Especially, again, as it related to the adjunct. They had tried to make changes in the previous contract and weren't successful, and we had a feeling that was going to be another attempt during the last negotiations, and it was. And so we were just holding firm, and we would have been willing to go on strike for that issue alone. And the other thing that we were really worried about was the quality of the education that our students are going to get. And so, yeah, those were difficult issues, and it did lead to a lot of, there were times things got pretty heated in some of those discussions. there was one meeting that both Ken Mash, who's the president, and I just got up and left, which we probably shouldn't have done, but we just had reached a point where this is getting ridiculous.
Would you want to describe like what happened or how that happened?
Honestly, Jason, I can't remember. I mean, I remember exactly where we were. I can't remember what the issue was, but it just felt like we're beating our heads against a wall, and it had been a long session and a long number of days. It was toward the end of the day, and I think we both just kind of looked at each other and thought, we're leaving.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the team was sitting kind of looking at us as we left, thinking, what are we supposed to do now? But again, it was toward the end of the day, and we didn't do it for effect. It was just like, we've had
frustration.
Enough. Yeah, we've had enough for today.
Okay. So the journal mentions a few marathon negotiations that took place before the strike. It mentions a 5-day negotiation in late September. So what were these marathon negotiations like? Did they differ from the ones you were normally doing?
Yeah, in as much as I mentioned before, we would go out and maybe have a 1-day meeting. So we'd start at 9, and sometimes we'd be done by 1. So you have all the faculty coming in and folks from their side as well, and it just seemed like you can't get much done. And I remember the one leading up to the strike, but we did have another session in later September, and the difference is now you're going in, and often it would be this was the other interesting thing, they never wanted to negotiate on the weekends. For us it's easier because we don't have class, but they're always reluctant, I guess, they have all kinds of time during the week. We would propose, coming in for a Saturday, Sunday, and that was always like, no, we're not going to do that. But so we were able to identify times, and there was actually one week, for the first time ever, that I had a colleague cover a doctoral class for me because I just was always adamant that I'm not going to miss a class that meets only 1 day a week. But in that particular session, I think we were maybe like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And so those days usually went longer. So you'd start early and sometimes go until evening. Mm-hmm. And you're able to at least, for the most part, sit and have longer discussions about some of those issues. But even during those, there were times when there was a caucus going on, so we might have been sitting by ourselves at the table for a couple hours while they were off in another room looking at our proposal and coming back with a counter proposal. So those kinds of things happening.
Did you guys normally meet in the same place, or were there shifting places where you were holding the meetings at?
Yeah, so both, and I'm trying to remember in September, when we got closer to the strike, we were actually in a neutral location, but generally we were either meeting at the Dixon Center, so we'd be kind of on their home turf, or they would come into Harrisburg where our offices are located, and we would meet in our office. So those were the two primary locations. So they were always in either at the Dixon Center or at the APSCUF office. As we got closer, we went to, and in the press it was a neutral location, but we were meeting on the 3rd floor in 2 meeting rooms at the Hilton Hotel in downtown Harrisburg. And part of that was, that's where all of the folks coming in, we were staying there. But we just had larger rooms, slightly more comfortable rooms, and we were there for, I honestly have lost track. I think the leading up to the strike, which started on a Wednesday, I think we were there Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So we were in Harrisburg for that entire time. And there were sessions going until late in the evening. And we would typically be able to take a break to have, sometimes we had lunch brought in. We'd be able to take a break to, go get some dinner, but then we'd be back. And some of those went until 10 o'clock. And the night before the strike, we were there until our side was there till 5 a.m.
Oh, when did you start that day?
We started Tuesday morning, we usually started between either 8 or 9. And so we were there all day Tuesday, moving into Tuesday evening, and then, into Wednesday morning. And I remember myself and Ken Mash, who's the president, and Chris Hallen, who was another member of the team and is a faculty member at Bloomsburg. We just went outside. Must have been like 11 o'clock at night, just to kind of walk around and get some air, because it was just, you're just getting to a point where by that time they had walked away from the table. And we were sitting out there like, I can't believe they left. And what do they think is going to happen here in, 6 hours?
Okay, so another thing mentioned in the September press release and from the press release was the disagreement between the use of fact-finding and binding arbitration. So why do you think there was a disagreement over which was used, even though you presented statistics saying that your method would have been much more successful?
They certainly didn't want binding arbitration because I think they realized some of the proposals they had on the table were ridiculous, and that probably an arbitrator is not going to. Are you talking about when we proposed?
I believe you proposed. They proposed a fact finding with who it was is blanking on me now. But then you guys proposed binding arbitration. Yeah.
The fact finder is, it'd be somebody come in and it would have been probably more a delay tactic. So we'll have a fact finder come in and we kind of responded, well, if you want to do that, let's just go to binding arbitration and we'll resolve it that way. Why have somebody come in and say, well, we think, on this issue, you're correct on this issue, this is, and it carried no weight after that. It's just somebody saying, on this issue, we think the union is right. On this issue, you might be on track. Well, if you want to do that, let's have it have some teeth. And they certainly didn't want to do that because they realized, but it would have been a delay tactic.
Okay, so moving ahead to the last round of marathon negotiations before the strike happened. So what was the mood of the other negotiators as you went into this final pre-strike these final pre-strike negotiations?
You mean on our team?
Yes.
I think at that point we were pretty hopeful. So if you have a deadline looming, we thought, okay, this is going to be, we're going to finally get these issues resolved. And so as they started, again, I think we were guessing we'll be able to come to agreement, make this work without having a strike, and we would be finished. Because, it's not as if we were going to if we had gotten to the point at 5 a.m. on that Wednesday morning and we were still negotiating, we would have delayed. It wasn't as if we were saying, this is a hard and fast deadline. If we're close, we're not going to go on strike. But the agreement we had was that there would be a media blackout, so that neither side was going to talk to the press about what was happening. And that we would stay at the table. So it was rather bizarre. It seemed like we were passing across the table a lot of proposals. We were getting some tentative agreements on some of those. And that's why I said, in the short article I wrote, I don't know what happened, but we had gone to, I don't know if we went to dinner, but we went out, a few of us went out for a walk because their side of their negotiation team was reviewing proposals. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe we did have like a dinner break. So I came back into the hotel. One of the individuals said, we need to talk with you and Ken and Stuart Davidson, who was our attorney. So we went over to their room. They said, this is our last best offer. The media blackout's over, and we're done negotiating. And so and there's like a term called regressive negotiation. So this would be a situation where you and I would come to some agreement on issue A, and then they would turn around another proposal and actually step that back. So even though we had kind of agreed, we'll do this, they would go back to a prior position that was away from the place where we had ended up. So when we looked at their last best offer, there were things that we thought we had agreement on that just they had removed. So as I said in the article, it really appeared to me as if they had made a decision that we're going to call their bluff. They had said all along that APSCUF always threatens to strike and they never do it. That, we cry wolf. So I think that they had just decided we're going to see if they'll do it. And even prior to that, during that marathon negotiation, there were meetings going on between the chancellor and Ken, who's the president, and they actually met in the governor's office to try to get resolution on some of these issues because the governor was concerned about a strike as well.
Oh, and just for clarification, could you say who the chancellor was at that time?
Frank Brogan. And I think after the strike, all the students knew who he was too.
So like you had said, it seemed like you were in a constant state of work and away from home during the strike. And I know, again, we could get into it a little later on. It talks about how some families there were some family troubles like because of the strike. What was your being away from home so often? Was there any?
No, it's difficult. We have, as I mentioned, our boys are grown. Mm-hmm. Had our kids still been in school, I never would have agreed to do this. But it does put a lot of pressure on your spouse because you're not there to help out. And so we have, at that point, we had 3 dogs, 2 parrots, 3 chameleons, and a snake. And so, and they can be a lot of work. Mm-hmm. So, that puts, pressure it put pressure on my husband to have to take care of everything at the house, including laundry and grocery, just the day-to-day things that you usually are sharing and splitting responsibility for. So that was a burden, and for us, and then I think probably for other faculty, depending on the circumstances. So in some cases, we knew we had younger faculty. In our department, we had 3 brand new faculty who had just started in September or August. And they're walking in thinking, what do you mean we might be on strike? And if they're the sole breadwinner for the family, maybe, they moved in and spouses didn't yet have jobs. There were people worried about those kinds of things. And the other interesting, and it wasn't so much a dilemma, but the interesting thing that my husband and I were dealing with is I'm the vice president of the union, and he's actually the dean of the graduate school. So he's in the administration. So, he's considered a manager, and I'm in the union. And there were just things we had to agree we couldn't talk about. So when I would come home from negotiations, I couldn't sit down and say, here's all the things that happened. Mm-hmm. And probably as we were preparing for the strike and the administration here was doing strike preparations, there were things he couldn't tell me about. So that also, but we just had to know that was going to be part of it.
Now I'm assuming he was supportive of that then, even though you guys were kind of on opposite sides then?
Well, he was a faculty member for 30 years. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he understood the issues. And I think a lot of the administrators here understood some of the issues that we had. But yeah, he was supportive, but it still puts a lot of pressure and burden on when you're gone that frequently.
Okay, so let's talk about once the strike started. Now, how did the negotiating work once the strike? I know at one point it mentioned something about back channel negotiations.
Yeah, even before the strike, as I mentioned, meet often with legislators, and so Representative Reed, who's an IUP grad, after I became vice president, I made it a point to go and visit him and let him know what some of our issues were, and talk with him about those kinds of things. So I had a good relationship, and so as we were getting closer to the strike, I spoke with him, and he actually gave me his cell phone number. We exchanged cell phone numbers. And after everything broke down, I was communicating with him, and as you probably know, he's a Republican representative. Ken had, he was communicating with an individual from the governor's office. So sometimes when I would speak with Representative Reed, he was probably getting in touch with the chancellor, and Ken's talking through a person and getting information to the governor, and I'm assuming, I don't know this to be the case, I don't know if the governor was trying to talk with the chancellor, but everybody was trying to work to avert a strike. And then after the morning that we went on strike, and we had been up, I think at some point, maybe around 1:30, I did go back to my room and took like an hour-long nap because I'm not used to staying up that late. When the strike happened at 5 o'clock, we did, Ken went out and was doing interviews. The rest of us tried to get a little bit of sleep, and I maybe slept until 8 o'clock, from 5:30 till 8. And at that point I went to the Dixon Center, and we had, there were people picketing there, and I took some food to that location and then got in the car and drove home because I hadn't been home since the prior Thursday. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to actually see my husband and other folks. I got back to IUP and walked the whole picket line with Nadine, and that actually gave me a lot of energy to see, like, it worked. There are people out here, people all over the place. The student support was phenomenal, and I think that was the other thing that just was overwhelming. So I got to go home and was exhausted, and got to remember what my husband looked like. Slept that night in my own place, and then got a call first thing on Thursday morning that I needed to go back to Harrisburg. So I kind of packed up again and drove back because we were hopeful at that point that we were going to be able to resolve things. But during that whole time, I was still in touch with Dave Reed. I mean, trying to identify what some of these issues still were, and I couldn't believe they left the table. But then when I got back on Thursday, we were still doing back channel kinds of negotiations, and by Friday, we had made pretty significant progress. The last few issues that we had to resolve, I'm trying to remember what some of the last few things were. There were still some things with health benefits and a couple of other last things with retrenchment. But finally, I think around 3 o'clock, and we sat most of the day on Friday in our offices, just kind of waiting, getting these proposals back and forth. And one of the last things was, and this is a little bit complicated, but we were making changes to our health benefits. And there are times if people are close to retirement, they might want to retire under the old contract because the health benefits might be better for them. And my concern, and I expressed this on a number of occasions, was by the time this is going to get potentially ratified, we're going to have faculty who might have to make an immediate decision about retiring under the old contract. And so we were able to negotiate to give about a 6-month window for people to take their time and make a decision about whether or not they wanted to retire. So those were some of the last issues, and then even issues about, they were insisting that we would have to make up the classes that we missed, but wouldn't be paid for them. And so we had to kind of work that. Those were the last few things. So
Okay, so you mentioned the overwhelming student support. Were you expecting that kind of turnout?
No. I mean, I really believed that the students would be with us, and I think I mentioned in that short article, and I do believe it was the chancellor or others on their side, that I think they believed first that we wouldn't go on strike. And then second, if we did go on strike, a lot of faculty members would cross the picket line.
Mm-hmm.
And then third, even if the first two things didn't happen, if we went on strike and faculty members honored the picket line, that the students and their parents were going to be so angry and outraged that we were going to get a lot of public backlash. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen either. And so when I got back here and saw all the students out, I was floored. I think in my heart I knew that the students would be supportive, but I was just staggered at the number of students that were walking the picket line and bringing food. And I had faculty at our campus and others saying, we need to get this ended because I'm gaining weight. You know, students bringing donuts and water and all sorts of things, and had signs, and it was the same at all of the other 13 schools. Because on my way back to Harrisburg on Thursday morning, I stopped by Shippensburg University, and it was the exact same thing. There were students everywhere, picket line. I mean, it was. We truly thought that was going to be the case, but I was floored by the student support, and it happened at all 14.
Okay, kind of similar to that. It mentions a lot that you had support from businesses surrounding the campus.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wasn't here for most of that, but I found out later that, like the Pita Pit and some others, they were bringing trays of food, and probably I wasn't here, but they may have been taking them to we had an off-campus location for the APSCUF office. So I don't know of all the businesses locally, but I know the same thing was happening at the other 13 universities, because when I was at SHIP, there were businesses bringing food there as well. I think in part, some of the business owners recognize that faculty are going to be a lot of their customers, and maybe also just people thinking, they weren't treated fairly.
Along the lines of that, was there support for the strike from other unions?
Absolutely. We had a lot of support from AFSCME. In fact, when I came back to campus on that Wednesday, there were some members of other unions, after they had finished their workday, that were on the picket line. We have a really good relationship with the folks from the AFL-CIO. And so Frank Snyder, who's their secretary treasurer, was here on campus. When I got Thursday morning before I drove back to Harrisburg, I stopped by part of the picket line, and Frank was there. They also had helped us with our rally that we had in sometime that fall. They brought on Friday, he came back and had like some big AFL-CIO truck, but they were handing out hot chocolate. Some of the folks from I honestly can't remember the name of the union, and I should, but they were the union that represented the Verizon workers. So they had been on strike prior to us, and we had gone and supported them on their picket lines. So they were in support of us. We knew that the Teamsters weren't going to cross the picket line. So there was some concern about getting supplies to the various campuses, because if the Teamsters who drive the trucks aren't crossing the picket line, you're not going to get food and other things there. So yeah, we had a lot of support.
That was kind of one of my questions, like looking at kind of contingency plan things. If the strike had gone longer, and the Teamsters, I guess, weren't delivering supplies to the schools, what did you think it would have gotten that far? What were you did you have anything that to maybe remedy that, or?
To allow things to get to campus? No, we were probably pretty hopeful that it wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
The other issue that was happening that particular week was on Saturday. There were football games scheduled, and in some universities there were homecoming games, and so there's a lot of pressure to try to, there were concerns about what if homecoming is canceled because the coaches weren't on strike, so they would have had to go to the games, but the athletic trainers, athletic directors, they're part of the faculty union, and they would have been on strike. So you can't have football games going on if you don't have trainers.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that concern built in. Not, on our side at some level, but certainly on the side of the administration about, those sporting events.
So what did the union have any plans in place to accommodate families that were immediately negatively impacted by the strike? You talked about how a few of the newer faculty, they would have just moved here and they might not have had might not have had money or
Sure.
all their priorities in a row.
We had in the prior years kind of a solidarity fund, and what was happening with that was maybe more senior faculty could pledge I'll pledge this amount of money to the solidarity fund, and then if person A needed some money, they could tap into that with the idea that they would pay back the amount when they were able to. But what we came to find out as we were leading up to this strike was we couldn't do that. It was violating some basic, not necessarily laws, but you have to have certain status to be able to have a solidarity fund. So we had to tell people APSCUF couldn't be even at the local level, they couldn't be the group holding the money. Right, so if I pledged $500, it couldn't be somebody from APSCUF holding that money and then giving it to other people. So we tried to give some suggestions, but no, that was a concern, and we've since tried to figure out ways to remedy that in the event we would have something like this again. Because there are other unions that have those kinds of funds available, but they're very, very large unions that have, maybe hundreds of thousands of members. Our membership is about 5,000, so to be able to put enough money aside to be able to provide, some type of pay to everybody, we probably just don't have the funds to do it. But it was a concern.
And this might be the same answer to a different question, but I know whenever the faculty went on strike, they lost their healthcare benefits, and they obviously weren't able to use the daycare here on campus for their kids. Was there any thing that the union provided to kind of get around those things?
Well, I don't think so much the daycare, but the state system had made a decision that they put out letters that they were going to cut off health care. But the fact of the matter is, and we tried to explain this, there's some type of a grace period. So even if they said on Wednesday your health benefits are done, quite honestly, you still have a bit of, they had to go through and actually do things to make that occur. And there's still going to be a grace period that you have, and I want to say it's 30 days, and I could be wrong about that, before you'd have to go on to COBRA benefits. So we were trying to kind of allay the fears of our faculty that if this lasts that long, if the strike lasts that long, we have bigger problems than that. But we did have some people that were unable. I don't know if you know what a flexible spending account is.
No.
So you would take money out of your paycheck and put it into this account, and it allows you to use that money to pay for medical supplies or doctor's visits and those kinds of things. We did have some people that they cut off their cards, and so we had people going into doctor's visits and they weren't able to use their money to pay for those things. So there were a couple people affected by that. But And we did have some individuals really worried about the health care, and I recall, and I don't remember which university it was, but somebody who was maybe undergoing cancer treatment. And in those situations, we just told the person, cross the picket line if you have to. You know, I mean, if you have a child who's really, and you're really worried about it, then we don't want anybody to feel as if, you know, they were going to be ostracized if they crossed the picket line when they had those significant concerns. The other kinds of issues that maybe people wouldn't think about, in our probably biology department, they have animals. And so there were, I would say, probably on our campus, some level of back channel negotiations going on about how to allow faculty to get in and care for those animals without being seen as crossing the picket line. Because, you know, we weren't going to have a situation where you have animals dying or kids being negatively impacted.
Yeah, I do believe it mentions in the journal I think they had a retired faculty member escorting the faculty on.
Right. And at some campuses they actually had, the retired faculty, they have a union called APSCUF. So it's the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Retired Faculty. And so some of those members at some of our sister schools, they were going into buildings to see if there were any faculty that were teaching, to see if people crossed the picket line. So the retired faculty could be on campus because they weren't on strike, but at times they were playing a pretty pivotal role for us. I can't wait to join APSCUF.
Okay, so just looking at campus relations, whenever in the journal it talks about how the administration and the union had a cordial working relationship during the strike. So what steps did you take to facilitate that good relationship?
Are you talking about here at IUP?
Yes.
I think, and again, I'm not as involved at the local level as I once was. But the fact of the matter is, having visited most of the other 13 universities and having some awareness of what happens between their administration and the APSCUF at those universities, IUP has, for the last number of years, has had a really good working relationship between APSCUF and the administration. And I think that's a tribute to both sides. I think President Driscoll helps with that, but we have good relations and are able to work together on a lot of issues. So that predated the strike. Mm-hmm. And so that relationship, which was pretty solid, and both sides understood what was happening. But everybody knew that when the strike is over, you have to work together again. And so it doesn't make any sense to be, having a lot of conflict. Mm-hmm. So I think that helped. But at other universities that didn't have that kind of they didn't have those kinds of relationships, it was a bit uglier. With the kinds of messaging that was going out maybe from the president to students, those kinds of things, it was a very different feel. And I assume that all the university presidents, and again, these are assumptions I'm making, they probably received some information from the state system about how they should portray this. I don't know that all the university presidents would have done that, but the relationship that happened here during the strike was a direct result of the good relationship that existed prior to it, and then existed after it.
Okay, so going into, I guess, more public relations, so how did the union build and maintain support from the general public during the strike period?
Well, there was training for each of the campus spokespersons, and so there was always a person at each campus who would be the point person if there was contact from the media. But I think being able to get out some of the proposals that they had put on the table, especially as it related to the working conditions for our adjunct faculty, concerns about the quality of the educational experience for our students, I think by pointing out some of those issues, and even when there was a suggestion that we strike in April and we avoided that, I think those were the kinds of things they saw that we were trying to, in good faith, bargain and not go on strike. I think that helped.
Now, in the journal, you hear a lot about the positive press that the strike received from the public. Was there any amount of negative public opinion towards you?
Oh, sure, and especially as I look across the state and look at some of the newspapers in some of the other areas, and I don't know the name of all of them, but there's one near Bloomsburg, and there were some pretty negative op-ed pieces in that particular paper. So it really depended on which media outlet was covering. We have a pretty good relationship with Bill Shackner at the Post-Gazette and a couple other people at the Tribune Review. So when you develop those kinds of good relationships, they know who they can contact. And our press person, the person at the state system, her name is Catherine Morton, has a good relationship with the reporters, so she's able to get that information out. And also, what is her name? Jan. Gosh, I'm now forgetting her last name, but she's at the one of the newspapers in Harrisburg, and I think she's an IUP grad. And so, when you have those kinds of good relationships, you're able to get your message out. It doesn't mean that there were some negative comments made. There were some negative comments made by some students at some of the universities, but I think overall there was a lot of support. In fact, I remember driving home from Harrisburg, and I was really tired, so I was trying to call people I could talk to keep me awake. But our youngest son, who lives in Alexandria, Virginia, called me and said, "Hey, Mom, I just saw that you were quoted on CNN or some other outlet." So there was a lot of support from alumni as well. So we were getting, and the night before we went on strike, so when we were sitting there at the table, we were doing a Facebook Live. We did a Facebook Live kind of event. I was getting emails from some of my students and because the students became aware, and I think that's really when there was really a significant shift. We were doing that Facebook Live, and I think I looked like crap because it was been there so long. But as we're doing that, we're getting comments from students and other people that are watching. And the students at that point got really angry that they left the table. I was getting emails through the night from some of our students, and actually from a couple of our student workers in our department, that were thanking us for staying there. And it was after that the students were putting up signs, and even at the Dixon Center, where where in the world is Chancellor Brogan? So I think during that time when they left the table and we were still there, we had pictures going out that here we are at 2 a.m. and here we are at 3 a.m. and we're still here. I think the students got angry at that point.
So kind of related to that, what kind of lessons did APSCUF learn about building and maintaining public relations regarding the strike?
Well, I think the public relations happen year-round. So you're making sure in the local community, you asked about what we do locally. We take up donations to give to ICAP that help, provide sometimes food to the local food bank. We try to make sure that people are aware that we're doing things in the local community. I mean, we employ a lot of people, but we also give back quite a bit. And so you build those public relations year-round. So it's not really a matter of now we're on strike and we need your support. It's trying to make sure that you have good relations throughout. And so that's happening year-round, and making sure that you're developing those good relationships. And then when you get to a point where, hey, this is happening to us, that support's already there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So now, looking ahead. So the chancellor during the strike, Frank Brogan, has since left. So what is APSCUF's relationship with the new chancellor?
So the new chancellor is an interim. Her name's Karen Whitney, and she's the former president of Clarion. And while she was at Clarion, there were some problems in the relations between she and the faculty on that campus. And they actually had retrenchment letters on the table there, so they were planning to lay off faculty. So when she was selected, I wouldn't say we were thrilled because of the relationship she had with the faculty, because of the fact that they were retrenching and she was sometimes reluctant. The day that she first took her first day on the job, she asked to meet with folks from the various unions, and so I went representing APSCUF, and we actually met at Slippery Rock, and there were people from AFSCME and SCUPA. And at that time, I laid out some of the concerns we had. Those are never fun discussions. I also, before the strike, I went with a couple of other faculty and met with the chancellor and Cynthia Shapiro, who's the chair of the Board of Governors, to talk about the faculty concerns. And I got to be the one to deliver the message to Chancellor Brogan that there were faculty who wanted to take a vote of no confidence in him. And that, we were trying to hold it off, but he needed to know that the faculty were really angry. And those aren't fun conversations to have to look at somebody in the face and say, you're doing a terrible job. So in terms of the interim chancellor, we had concerns, and we're hopeful. She was the person who was at the Senate budget appropriations hearings, because it's going to be the chancellor who goes before the House and the Senate. And I was there and saw Chancellor Brogan testify, and so I was there last week. And I actually thought that Chancellor Whitney did a much better job than he ever did. But I think what we're most concerned about looking ahead is who's going to be the next chancellor. The last three that we've had, the last three permanent chancellors, have all come from Florida. So first it was Judy Hample, then it was Frank Kavanaugh. John Kavanaugh, I think was his name, and then Frank Brogan. Each of them coming from Florida, where, they have they're not dealing with unions. Mm-hmm. And there's been some concern that they maybe have been brought here to try to break the union. And I think Brogan truly thought that was going to happen. And I think he's partially gone as a result of the strike.
So looking ahead again to when do negotiations for the next contract start?
This is March 1st, so probably August of this year, because we have a 1-year contract that runs until July of 2009, June 30th of 2019, and you have to go to the table and indicate, that you're preparing to negotiate. There's a date, I think, in August. I don't remember exactly what that date is. So I expect we'll have at least one session sometime in that ballpark, and then I'm hoping that we're going to get serious and have a new collective bargaining agreement in place before the one expires in June of 2019. I think the strike is going to be a help because they know we're serious. In part, though, part of the negotiations are going to be dependent upon who the new chancellor is. So I don't know how long Dr. Whitney will be there. She started in, I think, September. I'm trying to remember when I went to Slippery Rock for that meeting. And the chancellor search is underway. So I don't know when a new chancellor would be selected. but that person's going to have clearly an impact on how negotiations would go.
Now, do you know how they normally select the chancellor?
Yeah, there's going to be members of the Board of Governor, and I don't recall. I don't know if they have like an executive, kind of similar to our executive council. They make up the search committee, but Cynthia Shapira has expanded it, so there's now at least there's a faculty member on the search committee, and I don't remember, maybe a student. So they would be the ones who would identify whoever they're going to be, the probably final 3 candidates, and then from that group they would select one.
Okay, so I guess really kind of winding down a little bit. Do you think that this is pretty far off, but do you think that you'll need to strike again in this next one, or do you think that they've learned that it'd probably be better to negotiate?
I'm hoping that they figured out it's better to negotiate, and again, the chancellor's going to be driving their proposals at some. I mean, that person's going to be driving their agenda, if you will, and I could be wrong, but I truly believe that Chancellor Brogan made a calculated error in trying to see, are they actually going to do this? And now that we did, and it was successful, and we had student support, we had public support, I think that put them in a much weaker bargaining position going forward. So I'm hoping that we don't have to go through this again. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to sit down, talk rationally, say, here are the issues, we need to be able to resolve them, and let's do that in a shorter period of time than, a year and a half. I don't think we'll go another year and a half without a contract.
And I guess just a final question. So going through going through all these negotiations and all, and the strike, what do you think? What do you think? Crap. Last question. Now I'm blanking. What do you think the union as a whole has learned most from this experience?
I think probably. Are you talking like local, but also at the state level?
Yeah, I guess just like the state, maybe the state as a whole. When I came back to IUP on that first day of the strike, you had faculty who were on a picket line and talking with faculty in other departments. So people they never, maybe didn't even know, they got to talk with for a couple of days. And so the friendships that were developed were probably something that maybe people weren't expecting, but also the solidarity, right? So that there weren't cracks in the line. So I think the faculty learned we can do this and it's going to be successful. In terms of what I learned was how committed the faculty are. I learned how difficult negotiations are, but also I think we all learned, and not that that none of us don't appreciate our students, because that's kind of why all of us are here, but just the amazing support for the students. And what struck me was we must be doing a pretty good job in terms of developing future leaders. So I think all of those kinds of lessons were good ones. And for the folks at the state system who claimed, they always cry wolf, what they learned was to not try to push us to that point again, because they saw what happened at all 14 schools. Okay. Was there anything that you thought was important that I might have, anything you wanted to add that I might have glossed over?
No, I think you really got, from beginning to end what was going on. You brought back a lot of bad memories. I'm going to have trouble
Sorry.
No. And it is strange. When you said it was 2016, I was thinking, can't be that long ago. It seems like it was just yesterday that this was going on, but it was a difficult period. I'm not looking forward to sitting across the table from those folks again, but I'm hoping that this time it's going to be very different. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Again, this is March 1st, and this was an interview with Dr. Jamie Martin.